I would say that I'm not going to go fast, but I am because, as you know, these are shorter talks today, so I'm going to move right along. But I'll make all the code available for this talk available on GitHub for you to view afterwards. So I'm going to talk to you all about Eloquent performance patterns, which is just basically database performance patterns in Laravel. So anytime you're building a modern web application, performance is obviously a really, really important piece of the project, right? You need your web app or your website to be fast, otherwise customers are going to get frustrated, or you're going to have to spend more money than you want on hosting. So anytime you're building any sort of app, performance has to be sort of top of mind right from the get-go. And one particular area that I've seen people make mistakes over the years is in how they use their database, or I should say how they don't use their database. I see a lot of people, not intentionally, but sort of accidentally, doing too much work in PHP in Laravel. Even just the collection object in Laravel. You know, we all use the collections object. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool where you can iterate over a collection of objects and do filters and maps and all different things like that. And we've gotten good at doing that, but I worry sometimes that that's come at the cost that we are doing more of this work in PHP and maybe not as much of this work in the database layer. And the database is actually really good at this stuff, and that can come at some pretty serious performance penalties if you're not careful. So I wanted to go through a bunch of the examples today, or a few examples of kind of how this can happen. But instead of going through kind of with a bit of theory, I thought I would just hack on this little demo app that I created. So it's called Anglers Online. So this is, I've actually, I just flew in from the cottage this morning. This is the week my family is always at the cottage, this is also my first Laracon ever. So it's, yeah, finally. So I flew in this morning and I'm flying out tonight, which kind of seemed like a good idea 3 months ago, but yeah. But anyway, so fishing was on my mind because I've been out fishing, and I thought, for this demo app, I'll create this little app called Anglers Online, which is just a pretend social media platform for sports fishermen. So, and what we'll do is we're going to basically just work through and add a few different requirements, basically pretend like we're building this app, and we have to kind of add some new features, and then we'll use kind of that as sort of some steps to illustrate some problems that you might run into from a performance perspective and kind of how I would tackle that. And we'll start simpler at first, and then we'll get into some more complicated ones. All right, so basically, before I jump into the code, I'm just going to show you real quick. So this is all the page is right now. We have a name, the club, so every single fisherman in this social media website belongs to a fishing club. We're currently logged in as Lloyd Montgomery, and he belongs to the Northern Pikes Fishing Club. And I'll just show you the database here as well, and hopefully I'll try to zoom in on a bunch of this stuff as I go here so we can all see it. I think I can zoom in. Yeah, all right, so I'm not sure I can on the left-hand side here, though, so you'll just have to trust me when I read out these table names. So the users table is a pretty standard Laravel default migration users table. The only addition is the club ID, which is a foreign key to the clubs table. I've seeded it with four different clubs. There's a buddies table, which is just a pivot table that connects two different users who are buddies. So user ID and a buddy ID. And then the more interesting table is a trips table. So the kind of the main feature of this particular app is that fishermen can post when they go on fishing trips, and they can say, oh, I went on this date and I went to this lake, and who knows, maybe they could share how many fish they caught or what buddies they went with or whatever. But this table is interesting because it has 250,000 records in it, so 250,000 records. It took my old 2015 laptop a while to seed that, but I wanted a decent amount of data in here to sort of illustrate the performance problems that you can run into. There's 250,000 because there's 1,000 users, 250 trips per user, so per fisherman. They fish a lot apparently, and so that adds up to 250,000. Okay, let's dig in. So I'm not going to hand type it all because I'm really not that great at typing. So it's going to be a lot of copy and paste, and then I'll kind of explain it as I go. So the first requirement here is what we want to do is we want to update this application to only show fishermen who belong to the club that you're a part of or who are a buddy of yours. So for instance here, if I jump onto page 8 in the pagination here, I can see that Bob here is a buddy of mine. And if I go to page 10, I can see that Zeb is a buddy. So I've preceded 6 buddies for Lloyd. And he's obviously part of the Northern Pikes Club, which has a bunch of users as well. So we want to somehow reduce this set from 100 pages to only those users that they're allowed to see. So what you might be inclined to do here is to create a PHP artisan, you might be inclined to make a policy. I think it's make policy, user policy. And then in there, let me just pull open the user policy, and then I'm going to just take 2 seconds here, make this all a little larger. Okay, so now this is just a standard Laravel users policy, kind of following the standard Laravel convention, and I created this view method. So basically just to check if one user, which would be our currently authenticated user, Lloyd, if he can see the other users. So we have this policy now, and now we want to actually implement the policy in our controller. So just so you know, the controller in this particular demo app is just the web.php route file. But let's go in here and say, okay, we want to drop that in. But in order to run this policy, we can't run that in the database, right? And the reason why we can't run that in the database is because the policy exists in PHP, right? We just made it. So we have to instead get all the users and then filter through them in the collection and return only the ones that the user can see. So if we rerun this here, it'll work. It works perfectly. We got the users from the Northern Pikes Club, and we can see the buddies there, and we got 26 pages here. But what we've done here is we've introduced some performance issues. So let's take a look at a few different metrics. I have the Laravel debug bar installed, which is really useful for finding these issues. So one thing here we can see is we're at 5 queries, 5 database queries. That's fine. Nothing really to be concerned about there. The main query here, the user's query, took 19 milliseconds. But previously, and I probably should have mentioned this, we were at about 4 megabytes of memory, and now we've jumped up over 7 megabytes of memory. Previously, we were running at about 40 to 50 milliseconds, and now we're over 300 milliseconds. And maybe most interesting at all here, I've added a custom metric to the Laravel debug bar called hydrated models. I find this a really helpful metric to look at when analyzing performance issues, because what can happen is you can run a database query that runs really fast. Like this query ran really fast, 17 milliseconds or whatever it was. But what you don't realize is behind the scenes, all that data is now being downloaded from your database, whatever your database is, and it's being loaded into memory in PHP. And not only is it being loaded into memory in PHP, Laravel now needs to go through every single one of those records and convert it into an Eloquent model. And if you're not careful and you have too many relationships all kind of like coming together, you can end up generating a lot of these models, and every one of those, even though it takes a fraction of a second, it adds up. So in this case, we're now hydrating over 1,000 models, which is way too much. So this is a pretty simple example. There's a relatively easy solution to this problem is to move this work to the database layer. So the way I'll often do this is I'll create a scope for this, which a scope is just a way of encapsulating some query builder logic, essentially, and putting it into a model. So I'll create a visible to scope. So I'll go over to my users model here, jump right to the bottom, and I'll paste this in. And let's look at this scope here for a second. It's very similar to our user policy. So our user policy said, check the clubs. If the clubs are the same, then they're allowed to see each other. Or if they're buddies, then they're allowed to see each other, right? So we basically need to reproduce this stuff that we're doing in PHP in that scope. So if we look here, we can say, yeah, all right, so if the current user is in the same club, or if that user is one of the current user's buddies. So you can see here that I create this visible to scope where you can pass through any user. So we'll be using it with the currently authenticated user, but you could actually use this scope for anything, any other user that you'd want to check this against. All right, so let's update our controller here. Jump in here, and we'll get rid of this stuff here. We'll just say, okay, now we want to load all the users, order them by name, only the ones that are visible to our current user. And if we reload that now, it loads really, really quickly. We have 6 database queries with our main database query running just over 2 milliseconds. So you can see we're selecting start from users, and this is just pretty standard Eloquent stuff, where club equals 3 or the ID equals one of the buddy IDs. And you can see over here, we're running in around 50 milliseconds, 40 to 50 milliseconds. Our memory usage is around 4 megabytes, and we're only hydrating 19 models. So that's great. So that's the solution to that particular problem. Next problem, very similar one, but a little bit of a different one. What if we wanted to sort all these rows? So right now, we're seeing they're just ordered by name, right? But what if we wanted to see the buddies first? So like, what if we wanted Bob and Zeb here and the other 4 buddies all listed first? How would we do that in the database? And this can be pretty tricky because you remember, like we had that pivot table, right? The pivot table has this information in it. So there's not really like an obvious way to sort this in the database right off the bat. So I've actually created a couple query builder helpers over the years. One of them is called an order by sub, which is order by SubQuery. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in to our user model. And I'll explain it briefly. So order by sub, so I have a package that has this available in it. And the source code's also right in the app service provider in here. Like order by sub is literally 5 lines of code or so. That's it. And the other one we're going to be looking at is add sub select in a moment. So I'm not going to go into the details of how these in particular work. Me and Taylor have already been talking about merging these into Laravel core at some point, so they're just readily available. But for now, so just know that that's where that function comes from. So we're going to order by sub, and all we're going to do is say select raw true. So all we care about is it's almost like a where exists query. So we just want to select raw true from buddies where the buddy ID matches and where the user ID matches the current user, right? And we're going to limit this to 1, although there would only be 1 record because SubQuery can only return 1 record back. And I'll show you the SubQuery that it generates in a second. And this works for ordering because true is sorted first. So if it's not true, it's going to be null, and true will sort ascending first before null. Okay, let's update our controller here for a second as well. And we need to make sure we run that here before the order by name because we want to order by buddies first, right? So that worked super quick. Once again, it literally had no impact on the performance of the page. The memory usage is still low. Page is still loading around 50 milliseconds. Still loading just 21 models here. And the actual query here is running around 4 milliseconds. So let's take a quick look at this in Post-it-code. Let's actually just run this query here to see. I'm not sure this is actually going to help here because you may not be able to see it that much better. But what we're doing here is if you look carefully here, this is what's being generated. Eloquent is saying order by, and then this is the actual subquery that's being run. So that subquery runs, it goes off, it figures something out. In this case, it's just true or null. And then it just returns that value, and then it sorts ascended from there. So that's what a subquery looks like. And I'll give you a better example in a moment as well, how that exactly works. Okay, so that's, we're clipping right along here, so that's good. So requirement number 3. So now what we want to do, and actually I'll just copy this for a sec. We want to go over to our template, and now what we want to do is we actually want to add the last trip date to this page, okay? We want to add the last trip. So remember that I said the trips table has like 250,000 records in it, right? So we need to somehow, for each one of the 10 users on this particular page, we want to find the last trip that they went on and just show the date. So let's just start with kind of like the naive way that you might go about this. So you might say, all right, you might go in here and do something like this. For this user, so this is going to be this column right here. For this user, give me their trips, so standard Laravel relationship, right? So the user model has a trips relationship right there. And sort that in Eloquent, or sorry, not in Eloquent. We're going to sort this because this is going to return a collection, right? So we're back into collection land here. We're going to sort that by the date that they went. We're going to grab the first one, and then we're going to just use this handy carbon differ humans helper. And just reload this, and sure enough, we get the last date that they went. So that's good. Right away here, though, we see that we have an n+1 problem. But that's something that's easy to fix because we know that we didn't eager load trips. So we're just going to go to our controller here and eager load trips, reload that again, and now we're back down to 7 database queries. So that's good. But if you look here, this is not actually great because what's actually happening now is we're loading every single trip for every single one of the 10 users on this page, which is amounting to a lot more memory and a lot more Eloquent models being hydrated. You can see that we're at over 2,500 models being hydrated here just to get this silly last trip value. And the page is now loading at like 300 milliseconds. And if we were to go in here and say, like, maybe we're not showing 10 per page. We're showing 100 per page. If we reload this again, now it's like really crawling because we're now, just like that, and this is how easy this can happen. We're now up over 25,000 Eloquent models being hydrated just to display this page, just because we're just working with kind of standard Eloquent relationships and not really thinking about what's happening behind the scenes. So one way you might think to solve this, I'll just drop this back. I'm gonna also change this, get rid of this eager load here. One way you might think to do this is like, okay, well, I can't load all those records because that's obviously a major performance issue. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna run basically a forced n+1 query. So as you may know with Eloquent, if you don't call this, if you just call this as a function, a relationship as a function, you get an actual instance of the relationship object back, which is basically the query builder, which you can then run a query against. So we're going to say user trips, except this time we're going to say, give me the latest one, and this is running in the database now, but only get me the first one, and then we're going to display it. So let's reload that, and that works, and it actually runs way faster. You can see our page is now loaded in around 60 milliseconds. So not terrible, and the models are low, so that's good, and the memory is low, but we've introduced an n+1 problem, right? Because we've done it this way, we have no choice but to run that over and over and over every single time. So this is kind of an interesting point, though, because I think sometimes we always assume that n+1 issues are the worst, but they're actually not always the worst. There are some situations that just running a few extra queries makes a lot more sense than trying to keep the queries to an absolute minimum and then do that work in PHP. Just because we just saw here, the performance issues show themselves a lot, like we really ran into performance issues more by doing that work in PHP than we did by literally just running 16 database queries on the page. But there's actually a better way to do this, and that's again with subqueries. I'm a big fan of subqueries, and I think they're kind of this little like underused feature of Eloquent that can really become super useful for situations like this where you need some piece of extra relational data and there's not an easy way to get at it, kind of just using like standard Laravel relationships. And I'm going to do this by creating another scope. And I'm going to put this scope on the user model, so I'll just paste it in and then we'll talk about it. So this scope is called with last trip date. And I'm using this other macro that I've created called add sub select. So the other one I said order by sub just means that it's just going to order by whatever result comes back from that subquery. This is saying like, no, we actually want to select a value, whatever value comes back from the subquery, and then alias it to the last trip at column. And then all we're doing here is we're saying, give me the went at date from the trips column for this user, ordered by the date that they went, because we want the latest one, and then limit it to 1. Okay, so let's just update our controller here. I'll put this down here, reload this, and we're still at 16 database queries because I need to do a couple more things here. I need to update the template. So I'm going to update the template, and I'm also going to add a cast because so by default, in my trip column here, I have this went at date time. So that's how I was able to use that carbon helper, the diff for humans or whatever it's called. So I'm going to need to add that for this custom subquery column that we're creating. So I'm just going to go to the user model, jump to the top here, and I'm going to paste that in here, and then I'm going to update the view as well, which is right here. Okay, and then let's look at what we're doing here. We're just saying user last trip at. So this is what's interesting. Like by using subqueries, Eloquent actually has no idea that this column is coming back from a subquery. It just thinks it's another column on that table. So we can add casts for it. We can do mutators. We can do whatever we want with that data, just like it were a normal column on that table. And then we can call diff for humans on it because I made it a carbon instance. So now if we reload this page, we're back in business and things are all like super good on all fronts. We have only 6 database queries. We're running around 40 to 50 milliseconds here, and there's only 21 models being hydrated. So let's look at this query that's being generated for 2 seconds. And then copy and paste it, it's starting to get a little bit longer here. But like a note here, it's still only taking 8 milliseconds to run this, even on my own old laptop here. So what's happening here is it's running, basically it's getting the users, right? And it's getting all the user columns, but right at the very end here, which you can probably hardly read unless you're in the front row here, but this last column over here is the last trip at. So that's where this subquery is. So we're saying, when we run this query up here, we're saying, give me users.star, so give me all the user data, and then select went at from trips for that user, order by went at, descending, limit 1, and then alias that column to last trip at. So that's like, this is pretty straightforward SQL stuff, but maybe not something that you've seen as much in Eloquent. Now, Eloquent uses subqueries sometimes, but a lot of that's kind of abstracted away. But to write your own subquery like this isn't really possible without this macro, and it's super, super powerful. So let's say, though, what if we wanted to add a bit more information about the last trip? It's like, okay, that's great. We know that Bob went 5 days ago, but like, what lake did he go to? I'd love to see where he went. Well, one simple way to do this would just be like, okay, let's go off and add another scope, and this time for that extra column. And I'll paste this in here, and this scope is literally identical to the previous scope in all ways, except instead of returning the date, we're returning the lake. And so if we update we have to then call this scope, right? Because scopes need to be, you got to tell it when to run. So I'm just going to say with last trip date and with with last trip lake, and then we'll update our template. Okay. So I'm just going to remove this whole column here, and we'll just replace it with this one. So now all we're doing is saying, okay, display the last trip at, and then also the lake here. Reload this page, and there we go. We have all the lakes being loaded now as well. So again, we're running one database query to get all this information. We're just using a subquery to get this extra information about this particular trip. And it's still running at, like, this query is running in under 10 milliseconds, and the page is still loading super fast. We have no memory issues or anything like that. So you might be thinking at this point, it's like, okay, well, what now if I wanted to make this like, what if I wanted to make this like a link where I could go to that actual trip page and maybe view some more information about maybe the fish that they caught that day or what buddies he went with or whatever. How would we do that? Do we need to now add another column just to get that information? Like, do we have to go here and duplicate this scope again and add it for just the ID, for example, so that we can generate a URL? And you can do that, but this is not typically how I do that. I'm kind of building up to help you understand how this works. But what I would actually do in this situation is I would create a dynamic relationship. So let me just walk you through this. First, just pretend for an instance here that we actually have on the user's table users.last_trip_ID as an actual foreign key. So that would be how you would make this relationship. It belongs to where the last trip is last_trip_ID. That's how you would make that as just a normal Laravel relationship. But that obviously doesn't exist on the user's table. So what we want to do is we actually want to use this standard Laravel relationship along with one of our subqueries to get that column dynamically. So let me show you how you do this. I'll just get rid of that one. I'll say with last trip, get rid of date here, and I'll say select last trip ID, and then select the ID instead of the date, and then I do this little thing here where I just say with last trip. So I don't have to eager load. I don't have to call with manually. It'll just be assumed when I'm using the scope that it's going to eager load the last trip, because that's the only time you would use it. All right. So let's go back now and update our controller, and let's get rid of these two calls, and let's just say with last trip, nothing else. And then let's do a little more updating here. We can go into our template, then we can get rid of all this stuff, and we'll just replace this whole column now with some code that looks a lot more just like a standard Laravel relationship. So user last trip ID for the URL, the date for the date, and the lake, right? And then what we can also do is we can actually go back into our user model, and we can go back up to the cast here, and we can get rid of this date time cast here because we're not using that anymore. So the last trip is now gone. All right, now if I haven't broken anything here, this should work. And sure enough, it does. So now you can see here that I have a link. So you probably can't see it, but it's showing in the bottom left there. That's trip number 1,555. And it's still got the date, and it's got the lake. But you'll notice that we went up one database query. And that's because now our subquery is only getting the ID, but it's eager loading all the trips as a subsequent query. Anytime you can avoid caching, that's a win. And I think using subqueries like this and using these techniques gives you a whole bunch of tools that allows you to avoid caching until it's absolutely needed. And sometimes caching is as simple as this, like to cache this particular value is not even that hard, but you can run into situations in like real-time apps where caching can be a total nightmare. So this is why this is gonna be such a helpful tool. So yeah, that's really all I had. I hope that all makes sense. I would recommend using the Laravel debug bar if you don't right now. Definitely use that to get a sense of the metrics of your app and how well each one of these things are performing. I always look at queries, how much memory I'm using, how long the page is taking to load, and how many models I'm hydrating. Like those are really, really important metrics to keep in mind. And just be conscious. Every time you break out of the query builder and you start pulling that data into a Laravel collection and you start working on it, be aware of how much that could grow. Because you might be building some new app and you maybe even have a whole bunch of seed data. Maybe you have 1,000 records of seed data, which feels like a lot, and your app feels super fast while you're building it. And then you deploy that thing to production, and then you start having real user data come on. And maybe even at first it feels okay. But then in a few months, you go from thousands of records to 10,000 of records to hundreds of thousands of records and maybe millions of records. And that's when these issues are really going to start to show themselves, because PHP is okay when you're dealing with even tens of thousands of records. But if you start getting into more than that, you're really going to start noticing some performance issues. And it's not even because your database queries are running slow. That's not even the issue. It's just you're downloading, you're just taking too much memory from your database, and you're pulling all that stuff, or too much data from the database and pulling that all into memory in PHP. Okay, so that's all I had. The one thing I did want to share briefly, if this was interesting to you at all, I'm going to do the classic announce a project of mine. I am releasing a course all about this stuff called Eloquent Performance Patterns. It's a course I've wanted to do for quite some time, which basically digs into all this database stuff a lot more deeply, kind of in a screencast video course sort of format. This is something that I hope to put out this year if all goes well. This will certainly put the pressure on me to do that. So if you are at all interested in learning more about database performance and some of the things I've just talked about, be sure to check that out. It's at reinink.ca, which is my last name /Eloquent course. You can sign up there, and I'll be sure to tweet it in a little while as well. So you can, if you want to find me there, it's just twitter.com/Reinink for me. That's all I have. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.